Hey there, gang. So a few days ago, Behavior proposed probably what many would consider some of the most controversial set of changes that have ever been considered for this game. Everything from Basekit Unbreakable to extra forms of anti-tunnel protection that make it a lot harder to tunnel out survivors. And even further, if you do so happen to tunnel out a survivor despite these new systems being put in place, you are going to be punished for that. They were really trying to discourage killers from tunneling. They really want killers to spread their hooks. And while the numbers and everything presented made a lot of people on edge, a lot of people don't want to go along with these changes simply because of the fact that they don't consider them to be positive. I do see those criticisms. I do very well understand, and I'd even say go along to agree, right? But I feel like, in my opinion, as we really take a deeper dive into these changes, the issue stems specifically with the implementation. It's mostly about the numbers. It's not about the concept, I think, that was the problem, right? I've been personally saying for a while that I feel like what this game needs is they need to standardize the objective speeds, right? So when it comes to generator repair speeds, that's not really influenced so much by perks. I felt that also when it comes to healthy build variety for survivors, right? Having to, in the same way that killers would run generator perks, feeling that you need to run anti-tunnel perks, that's also not really conducive toward healthy design, right? Because when you look at how the game kind of has been up to this point, there really has been a lot of pressure for both sides to have to take certain specific perks, and also as a result of that, play toward a specific type of strategy that both sides really don't necessarily like being a part of. You know, the only people that really like being tunneled when it comes to survivors are those that are really good in chase. And while that is good for them, right? Typically people that are good in chase, they can do a whole lot for their team by distracting the killer if he is that so much fixated on taking them out of the match. A lot of people that do play Dead by Daylight, gang, they're not that good, you know, respectfully, right? A lot of people are very casual, and we're kind of going to get into that. And that on a very surface level, right? We haven't even really gotten anywhere at all into the specifics. We're going to be talking about all of this stuff, about why I do think, beyond the strict implementation because of the numbers, that the developers were on the right track. I did like, before they showed us the numbers, right? When we saw a previous, before the PTB came out, they kind of gave us the concepts, you know, and a lot of people were nervous about that. I was a little bit curious and looking forward to it. You know, the fact that it's being delayed, though, is probably for the best. I do think that when it comes to something of this nature, it needs to be done right. And where it was, you know, there's more that needed to be built upon it. So first things first, we're gonna go look. I'm gonna give you guys, I'm gonna read down the changes on the PTB with you. I then have also prepared a document, a presentation, if you will, probably one of my longest ones to date. And within that presentation, I'm going to be discussing some observations about the game. From those observations, we are then going to be looking at some pros and cons, right? So basically what's good about the patch, what is also bad about the patch, and also specifically, right, why a lot of people are rightfully concerned. And lastly, I also do want to offer my own solutions, because in the same way that I feel like we are going in the right direction, I feel like if we continued in this direction properly, it would be better for the game, both playing killer and survivor. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead now and pull up these patch notes here, and we'll just kind of start going down. We're not going to be looking at, or at least I'm not going to be talking about things that are more killer specific. So like the Michael Myers change, Clown, all of that. I mean, not even really specifically looking at Clown, right? We'll be talking about Clown in a later video. The long and short, though, for people that are wondering, I do think Clown is in a much better place on the PTB. I personally asked for 1.5 seconds on his pink and yellow bottles for their activation time and slowdown at base, respectively. They gave us 1.6. I think that's great. So, you know, we'll talk about all the dimensions to that for Clown in a different video. We're mostly just going to be looking at the universal stuff here. So things like the anti-slugging, anti-tunneling, all of that. So give me just a second here, gang. So let's begin by looking at what they're calling their tunneling reduction update. In this set of changes here, they're giving survivors a whole lot at base kit from 10% haste for 30 seconds, in addition to endurance. You're not going to have collision with other players, which means your teammates can't get in your way. It also means that they can probably body block for you easier by getting behind you without also getting in front of you, right? They can kind of control their movement and their positioning when it comes to protecting you in the event that the killer is able to hit the person that they're tunneling. And in addition to that, you're able to see the killer's aura for 32 meters. That is crazy. That's basically seeing them at the edge of their terror radius. You're going to be able to pre-run very effectively with that information. You're also similarly going to be able to play a lot of tiles way, way better, especially since with that information, you're going to be able to easily determine when to break chase, probably when to drop pallets, right? If you're running windows of opportunity, that means that you pretty much have the perfect set of information for your chases if you have the understanding of what to do with that information. So really, really don't sleep on that. Also, immunity to AFK crows, that's also really, really big. It means that you can immerse yourself without worrying about anything giving you away, right? The systems that are otherwise used in order to discourage survivors from not helping their team. Well, this system is going to create a distinguishment between that system and you essentially hiding to prevent the killer from capitalizing out of you on you being caught out of position, right? If you're sitting behind a rock or sitting near the corner of the map, the game's not going to treat that as you not helping your team, because if you are otherwise vulnerable and thus by virtue of not getting caught, you're helping your team, right? That is kind of seeing this as you are doing something good. So that's also really important to kind of consider. The effects are going to go away 3 seconds after being fully healed, which is probably, I can kind of understand why they're doing that. You're already going to have two health states if you're healthy. Similarly, it's only going to be active for 30 seconds anyways, so it's not like with the heal, barring like really fast healing perks, medkits, etc., that there should be like it shouldn't be expected commonly that the duration would have been active anyways, is what I'm trying to say, right? So it going away after being fully healed, I think, is also not really a problem. And they also lastly said that the effects are going to be disabled when all generators are completed except for haste and endurance effects. Now, initially, I was concerned about this part because I thought what this meant is that survivors are going to have 30 seconds of endurance in endgame in addition to 30 seconds of 10% haste. But from playing on the PTB, I will say that it appears to be it is only the original 10 seconds. So that is good, because if it was 30 seconds, that definitely feels like it would be borderline uncounterable for some killers. Maybe not for others, right? Some of the higher tier ones with very strong chase powers. But for some of the other lower tier ones that don't really have good chase powers, or maybe more based around area denial, maybe they have something like a exposed insta down or stalk gimmick, right? These are the type of killers where survivors had that much haste. Well, you're not really over a continuous period of time when you're just looking at straight movement. The killer is not really going to be able to do anything against the survivor endgame, just straight up running to the exit gate off hook, right? So I do think that it being reduced to 10 seconds during the endgame phase, that is very, very good. I think the endgame phase to begin with especially needs to be the shortest phase of the game. I think it should be very high stakes. We'll kind of look into that later when we get to my PowerPoint. But next, hook status update. When a survivor is hooked, the hook status is obscured for the killer. The killer can't see the hook status in the HUD, can no longer see the hook's R at all. When the survivor is unhooked, there is no loud notification, and you also really won't even know when that happens. So this is also really, really big. It kind of requires killers now, in essence, if you are going to tunnel, if you are going to proxy, you have to play purely off of game sense. And this is a change that probably will hurt more middle to casual killer players more than higher tiers. People that have been playing this game for thousands of hours, y'all, you could like literally double the time on this. And I guarantee you, they're just going to know when the unhook happens. They're going to have just the understanding based on what took place up to that point in the match, leading to the hook, following the hook 10 to 15 seconds. You know, they're going to know when the unhook will take place. And if they're a higher tier killer like Nurse Blight, etc., Billy, they're going to have the mobility to capitalize off of that. So this is not going to be the really, really top percentage of players. This isn't really, I think, going to be a problem. This middle and lower tiers. But why does that matter, right? If this is only going to affect the middle and lower tiers, why does this belong in the game? Because again, as I've talked about before, most of the people that do play this game, they don't play it both with the understanding, right, or even just the knowledge of people that have thousands of hours. They don't have the game sense to know when to return to the hook. They need that R reading to probably even remember where they hooked that survivor. They need the loud noise notification to know when they need to turn around and return to the hook. All of that stuff, right? So if you obscure that information for people that are on like the average to lower tier of skill that play killer, then you make this less tenable as a strategy, and thus, by virtue of that, it functions as a disincentive for the strategy for these players, and it pushes them more to something alternative, which is, again, right, that is where incentives come into play. And it's also a good time to transition to what they are now calling their unique hook bonuses. So we just discussed a disincentive, something that basically makes you not want to tunnel, not want to proxy, because if you don't have, as a middle to average player, you're probably not going to be doing that very well. Well, here's your incentive now in order to spread hooks, in order to just basically hook a survivor, not necessarily return, put pressure on someone else who's working on your generators on a different part of the map, right? When hooking a survivor that is on a different from the last hook survivor, the killer gains 20% bonus instant regression based on current progress to the next generator that they kick. To my understanding too, by the way, gang, this does not have a timer. So this is literally just a buff that permanently exists until you kick a generator the next time, which is really, really good. You obviously will want to get the most out of this kick by kicking a generator before you rehook another survivor, right? So that way you can get 2 bonuses to instant regression if you are playing the most out of the timer and not kicking before you get a second, basically a second hook. You get what I mean? So that is just to kind of just put emphasis on that. It's not like Pop is what I'm trying to say. Pop is a 45-second timer. You basically have to gamble on, is it worth to not chase a survivor because I need to make sure that I get value out of my pop? This is it's not a, you get to have your cake and eat it too. And that's really, really good, especially since as a form of instant regression at Basekit, there's less of an impetus as a killer player to have to run instant regression in your loadout, which is also, I think, very good. I think I mentioned previously in the video, it trends toward where I think makes the game healthier, which is when objective speeds for both sides become standardized. So I also really, really like that. Not even so much looking at the numbers, just the concept. 10% haste for 15 seconds. That is one of the other next changes as well, by the way. That I think is also really good because if you have a 15-second window, then you're looking to get the most out of that 15-second window. 10% haste. I don't really know about where I feel like the number should be, I will say. I don't know if 10 seconds is enough, gang. I think for some killers, 10% may not be enough. Ones that don't have, like Clown, I think it probably could be, right? I play Clown, so if I run Garsh Makeup Kit and, Garsh Makeup Kit and Cheap Gin Bottle, I'll have 15% for 8 seconds. You stack that on with that 10% for 15 seconds, and I'm moving 25% faster for basically the full duration if I refresh my yellow bottle. So yeah, Clown gets off better than some other killers, but look at someone like Trapper, gang. What is Trapper going to do with 10% haste for 15 seconds? Like, yeah, he probably does a teeny bit more to stop the pre-running, but like, that's it. You know, he's ultimately not going to see the same level of returns compared to a different killer, and that's kind of why I'm a little bit leery about this change with respect to some of the killers who need this help more. You know, it's just kind of moot. They're only going to be really seeing probably best out of this 20% to kicking generators. And, you know, that kind of leads also to the other point, right? When it comes to not really being able to get anything out of the base kit, out of these base kit effects. The next one here, revealing all survivors outside of 40 meters that have less or equal hook states to the last survivor that you hook for 4 seconds. If you're a killer that doesn't have very strong mobility and you're only getting 10% haste for 15 seconds, right? How are you going to be able to do anything off of this? Especially if you know through game sense that the generator is going to be completed anyways. If 10% haste for 15 seconds means you don't reach the generator in time before it gets popped, then you very well need to ensure that by virtue of both losing the generator and not being able to proxy the hook, which is typically what you would otherwise do beforehand, right? You would want to proxy a hook when a generator would have been completed because you can't pressure the generator and you're pulling survivors to you and you play off of that. If we're making the latter no longer a viable strategy and you've pretty much just have to leave the generator, or the hook, to go toward a survivor who will still finish a generator, that needs to pan out in the long term. And I don't think it does, right? this is just, again, this is my surface level take. And going forward, they did say that some other killers are not going to be getting these benefits. 5% for Blight, Dark Lord, Ghoul, Hillbilly, the new killer Krisu, and Nurse. They're going to get half, basically, so only 10% on Next Generator, 5% on Haste. I really don't know how I feel about this, because once you start splitting killers on categories for certain base kit benefits, it kind of makes things very arbitrary, right? You kind of have to decide, well, does this killer belong in this category for the double benefits because of this reason, or is it because of this reason that they need to be in the nurse category where they're, or, you know, the nurse and black category where they only get 10% bonus regression and 5% bonus haste, right? And if a killer who needs the double benefits that all of the lower tiers are getting is put into the category with nurse and blight, and that means that they aren't able to reasonably perform as well, well, that's going to kind of feel awful, and it's something that puts impetus on the developers to have to be balancing around that, right? Because if the developers just simply don't give the killer that change, and when they need it, then people are just going to struggle and not want to play those killers, right? You kind of get what I'm saying? It's just what I'm trying to really suggest in a short sense is that it probably may make balancing these killers harder when you start adding base kit buffs that are split between different killers by an arbitrary category. Going next, tunneling penalties. So these are the really, really heavy disincentives that we were talking about, right? Like we just talked about some incentives after talking about some disincentives for wanting to tunnel. Here's some even more disincentives. When a survivor dies to a hook action or more before 6 total hook states, the remaining survivors get a 25% repair speed bonus. Further, when a survivor that was previously hooked is killed or sacrificed, the killer loses the ability to block, damage, or regress generators by any means. So this has confused a lot of people, and to really break down what it means, is what this means is you can't just ping pong between two different survivors in order to not tunnel, right? I think some people have called this soft tunneling in the past, but hooking Survivor 1 and then hooking Survivor 2, then hooking Survivor 1 so they're now on Death Hook, and then you hook Survivor 2 so they're on Death Hook, and then you hook Survivor 1 again so they're out of the match. You're at 5 hooks there. They don't want that to turn into a 1v3 as the main strategy alternative to what it was beforehand, right? Where people are getting someone out of the match at 3 hooks. They don't want you to just say, okay, well, I'll just get them out of the match at 5 hooks. Because if you set it to 6 hooks, right, you can't, or beyond that, which is the number they have it at, you can't just bounce between 2 different survivors. You have to interact with the majority of the team, because if you don't, well, you're probably going to give the survivors such a buff in the 1v4 that you definitely won't be able to keep up with them, right? If you can't slow down generators with your base kit kicks that are now buffed by 20%, if you can't slow them down with pain resonance, if you can't, anything else of that nature, dead man switch, how exactly is it, especially if the survivors have a 25% repair speed bonus, how is it that you're going to be able to win your matches? That's what I think that they were trying to do. And especially, right, I know I talked about bouncing 1-2, 1-2. All you really need to do is just wait till the survivor gets unhooked when they're on Death Hook. Instead of it being 5 hooks, you take them out potentially at 4 hooks, right? They didn't want either of these two strategies to be considered by killers opportunistically. They quite literally want it to be, when survivors are taken out of the match, they are taken out of the match at 6 hooks minimum. So that is most of the changes here. They also did update some perks. They updated Barbecue and Chili, Eruption, Pop Goes a Weasel, and Pain Resonance. All of these, to my understanding, either got a rework or they got nerfs. I do think nerfing perks is sensible if the idea is to standardize instant regression and move it to base kit, right? Because it's not as if you're being left without, per se, because one of the problems with just nerfing the perks and nothing at base kit is it is a difference when you are running chase perks, you are running info perks, right? They're only nerfing the perks because the expectation is that by making it base kit, these nerf perks have to compete with these other perks, and this is something I'm going to talk about later, which is going to incentivize killers to run chase perks, to run R-reading perks, instead of just stacking for regression perks, right? Because it's just not going to work out as being better. So that's what I think that's about when it comes to the perk nerfs. Up next, the slugging reduction update. While in the dying state, the resolve bar appears below the recovery bar. When the resolve bar fills after 90 seconds, with progress not resetting between each down, survivors are now able to pick themselves up off of the ground as if they had Unbreakable. So this is basically Basekit Unbreakable that doesn't reset between each down. This means that if you're slugged over and over again, you don't have to fill that resolve bar from 0 to 100 every single time. And this means that after 90 seconds cumulatively of being on the ground, you don't have to worry about having teammates to pick you up. You're able to continuously just pick yourself off of the ground wherever you want to be. And further, they also made it, I believe, below this, they also added a change where survivors are able to simultaneously crawl and recover. Now, this is probably almost as big of a deal as the Basekit Unbreakable itself, because being able to recover and crawl at the same time means that you don't have to choose between remaining out of position and having a full recovery bar. Having a full recovery bar means that if you are out of position and the killer is distracted, somebody can swoop in and pick you up off the ground without really wasting much time. If you tried to crawl to a different area instead of this, building up your recovery bar before this change that they're proposing, then you would not have any recovery meter after you got to where you wanted to be, which meant that your teammate, as they healed you, right, they had to heal through your recovery bar for you. They had to get that healing progress. And this was a bit of a problem for a lot of survivors, because if you aren't playing with a coordinated team, and no one is able to heal you when you're caught out of position because you chose to stay out of position and recover with the expectation that a teammate would pick you up off the ground, well, the killer's going to return to the ground, right? He's going to return to where he downed you, pick you up, and he's going to rehook you. You didn't really gain anything out of healing in that spot, right? But similarly, let's look at the alternative. What happens if instead of recovering out of position before this change, you crawled somewhere else and a teammate wasn't able to pick you up when they were running in to intercept you, and perhaps this was also the survivor who had the killer's attention? Well, they're not going to be able to heal you even though you're at a prime location to be healed, but the killer is also going to be able to pick you up and rehook you, right? Because there was nothing that you or your team were really able to do to stop that. Now, a lot of people would argue that this is a very problematic change to come in with the game, in addition to everything else that they're proposing for tunneling. And I think that when you look at certain killers, this is also a very good point to make, right? Killers like Oni and Twins, who do a lot of slugging, it's possible that when you consider this change, it discourages optimal usage of their power. And if we're going to redefine what optimal usage of their powers are to not include these strategies, then by virtue of that, we also have to accept that we're making these killers worse, right? By definition. And that, unless of course the other changes we proposed compensate for this. But I mean, let's be honest, gang, when you look at how these killers that I specifically mentioned function, that's probably not going to happen. Victor, you can't change from Charlotte or Victor when too close to a hook. When you look at Oni, when he picks up a survivor that he downs, it resets his power partially, right? These are killers that very much are encouraged to slug. They're not encouraged to play traditionally like other killers where you down and hook. And that is where a slugging update like this, I feel like, would be very problematic. And that's just looking at 2 of the 40 killers, y'all, right? Like, that's my bare, like, layman's understanding of just those 2 killers. There are probably many more killers who rely on slugging that I don't necessarily realize, because, y'all, I'm just a clown main, right? I mostly only play clown to begin with, so I am surely missing other killers who this really would hurt. And that's kind of just my thoughts there. Is I'm a little bit nervous about this, because I feel like slugging, following a lot of what behavior is introduced so far, especially with the knockout rework, right? Slugging is not only just in general not nearly as effective, but it's just, I don't even think it's that common, I would imagine. I personally haven't tried 4-man slugging as a strategy much at all, simply because it just hasn't really, not only was it already feast or famine, but when you just include some of the perks out there that exist to counter slugging, and some of them aren't even slugging specific perks, right? Made for this, for example. Survivor's Run made for this to counter Ghoul because of the deep wound. Well, made for this also gives you endurance when you pick up other survivors, right? So just looking at that alone, you already have just a coincidental counter to a slugging play style that a survivor has because they're trying to just counter a different killer, right? They're not even intending to do this, but they get that benefit, right? So you factor in this, you also go forward to consider the slugging reduction update. I really don't think, right, that I don't know, not only that it's probably as necessary, but it's definitely not going to happen, I think, going forward. This definitely will kill slugging as just a conventional strategy. And what's also funny on that point, too, they did make it to where after you've been slugged, looking at this add a new scenario to the abandon option, after you have been picked up from the dying state twice, you being healed from it, you have the ability to abandon the next time that you are downed. So this is almost seems as if they're treating getting slugged like a hook state, where if the killer is trying to slug you, he downs you, you get picked up, you get downed again, you get picked up, you get downed again. That's the same thing as being hooked 3 times, I guess, is how they're treating it. And now survivors are going to get the ability to just leave the match. I don't know if this is good for the other teammates that are in the matches, right? If this were to happen, but I feel like the reason why this is being added to the game is it's for player retention purposes. This is just so people don't get off the game because I'm telling you right now, y'all, if they probably like really think about who this is for. Survivors that are not very good at the game, very casual, and also just and I think especially when you look at slugging, right? Slugging is very hard to counter, I think, for a lot of survivors that play public matches. If you aren't like in comms, the slugging is much, much stronger as just a play style to conventional hooking just on the surface because you really do need pretty good macro coordination to counter that. And what this means is when you are playing solo queue and the killer's 4-man slugging, if you're not able to, I assume, abandon like they're proposing, you're going to get survivors who face a strategy like this. They get slugged 4 to 5, 6 times in that one match, and then they get off. They get off DVD. So that's what I think the abandon option is for. I think it's kind of humorous in a way, but I mean, like, I get it, right? And lastly, palette density. I'm going to be looking at this specifically in the presentation, so I don't really want to spend too much time here. But just as like a real brief introduction to this, they are saying that they're looking to adjust and add basically palettes to a lot of maps to remove their dead zones, right? When they're saying reducing the presence of dead zones by adjusting the quantity and distribution of the palettes, that's just a fancy legalese way of saying we're adding more palettes. It is kind of funny, but that is what they're doing here, gang, and we will be taking a look at that. But again, just as a reminder, y'all, I want to be very clear about this. These are not like beyond just kind of guesstimating or just kind of giving my perception on how I feel like this is going to impact the game itself. This isn't like my opinion on these changes as whether or not I think that they're good or bad for the game. I want to be very clear about this. The idea here is we're just reading the notes and digesting based on our understanding of the game, our game knowledge, what this is going to do. Now, when it comes to the opinion of whether or not I do think that these changes are good for the game, well, that's very complex and nuanced. It's going to require a lot of breakdown, and that is why I have taken the time making a presentation for that purpose. First things first, we're going to be looking at some observations, and I'm just going to be in these observations talking about just some general facts or truths that I feel like pertain to the game as a whole, both with how it's designed and also speaking to the player base. After that, I also want to talk about some pros and some cons with the system, because even though it is something that has a lot of backlash, there are some good reasons, I think, for it that also come with the system. And similarly, there are also some problems. There are some changes that definitely need to be made, which is why I have included with that my solutions. I do feel like if done properly, if the developers continued in the direction that they're going, they could actually do a whole lot of good with the system that they have initially proposed. Alrighty, gang. So I've gone ahead and moved myself down here. My apologies in advance if I end up blocking some text. There's only really so much I can do about that, and I felt like this position was the best compromise. I'll be sure to have a link in the comments to this presentation so you can go through, flip through all the slides yourself without me in the way. I know there's going to be a whole lot to read, and it's very likely that, I am kind of blocking a couple of critical pieces of information here or there, assuming I don't read it. But, going forward, we have a lot to talk about today. This is, I would say, probably my largest Dead by Daylight PowerPoint / slideshow presentation that I've made thus far. It has not one, but two table of contents sections, and I felt like, with what we were going to be experiencing, had they gone through with it in this next patch, it was very important to make sure that the proper feedback was going out, because I do like some parts of the concept and the direction the developers were taking the game. But it's very obvious that I'm sure a lot of people had pointed out there were some negatives, both with the execution and also just probably the extent that it went and what it was trying to accomplish, right? It didn't really fully seek to pull people away from tunneling with regard to incentive wise. A lot of people felt like the play styles that they were being pulled away from, right? Tunneling and proxying hooks. The alternative wasn't really giving them the juice from the similar squeeze, right? You're just not really getting the same dividends paid out. And so we're going to be taking a really full, whole scope look at talking about everything in relation to what the developers were looking to introduce in this next patch. And I'm also going to be providing some solutions. So like I was saying, there are going to be 3 sections here. First things first, before we actually start looking at the pros and the cons, I do want to point out some observations about the game. These are not, again, opinions. These are observations. These are just kind of, think of them as like side but important details that relate to what was going on within this patch or with relation to the game itself leading up to this point, right? Why it is that we were seeing, for example, everything at once, things of that nature. So first things first, before we get to those observations, I do want to provide a little bit of context to this. I had typed up most of this before the developers had announced that they were going to delay the patch. So I was not only planning to get this video out sooner, which thankfully, they did delay it. I honestly did need some time, gang, to recuperate. But this does also enable me to prepare this more properly, and I can present this as feedback, going forward, for if they do look to push through some of those changes, maybe they do it better, and maybe, the feedback provides some good suggestions. So that is just some context I want to give here, gang. I didn't type this up after the fact. I did have most of this typed before their announcement. And yeah, like I said, the upcoming slides, again, observations. These are not my opinions. So I don't want people to misinterpret what I'm trying to say with regard to what we're about to talk about here. And first things first, these changes aren't easy to implement or sustain. When it comes to the design direction that behavior is looking to take the game, when we're talking about, right, killers don't tunnel, killers don't camp, killers are encouraged to spread hooks or are able to do so in a reasonable manner where they compete with survivor objective efficiency, right, on generator repair speeds. It's important to realize, y'all, that this is very difficult to execute. And when it comes to the significance of how they do that, you can't understate that. A lot of it is about the numbers. If they don't give you enough haste, you don't feel incentivized to leave the hook. If the Basekit instant regression is there, numbers wise, right, you're not going to feel as if you're really afforded the opportunity not to still take generator perks. So execution also really matters a lot. And that is literally the game-breaking matter here when it comes to whether the game is made better or worse. Because I do want to clarify, right? If the whole point of these changes is to address a problem, then we do have to acknowledge that to some degree, where we're going with these changes, there is still a problem that needs to be solved. So we do need to make sure we solve the problem, right? But even if we decide, right, that maybe we're not doing it the right job this time around and we need to put it off, we need to still remember, gang, there's a problem, right? The problem of killers feeling like they lack an agency, the problem with survivors feeling as if They either have very little interactions with the killer because the killer doesn't find them early, or the inverse, where killer or survivors feel like they don't have any type of leeway or points to catch their breath if they're caught out early and they aren't really equipped or capable. They're just dead or taken out early into the match, right? That's the problem that we're looking at here. And that is kind of why, y'all, I do feel like we need to be very careful with our criticism, but we do need to make sure that we're being helpful and constructive. I do want to clarify, though, when I say helpful and constructive, that doesn't mean that you have to be positive. Constructive criticism, I'll even go as far as to say, y'all, the people that are saying, I don't want to play the game if these changes go live, that is constructive. If you genuinely mean that, and you are articulating that with genuine purpose, right? And you say these changes will not make me play the game, you are telling the developers, we probably shouldn't do this because we won't have a player base, right? It's not constructive if you say the developers don't understand the game that they're making. They don't play their own game. This is not helpful criticism. This is not constructive criticism, especially since, y'all, I can guarantee you the developers understand the game better than people think. It's just the execution of things is very difficult, and this is a very, very complex matter and situation, especially when you consider the problems, when you look at the asymmetric design of Dead by Daylight as a whole, right? This is not something that behavior just snaps their fucking fingers when it comes to a future patch and boom, problem solved. Killers don't need to camp or tunnel. Survivor gen efficiency is equally meted out at a similar ratio when it comes to how quickly killers are able to take their chases while spread across multiple survivors, right? I mean, really give them a break there, you know? Again, it's one thing to say these changes are very, very bad and I don't want to play this game because y'all are so far off base. It's one thing to say that, then to say that y'all are stupid and don't know what the hell you're doing. So kind of similar to that point. Well, actually, we'll get to that in just a minute. Why is everything happening at once? This relates to specifically why people were freaking out. They felt like this is a whole lot of changes to happen in one patch. Why aren't we getting some of this early and then maybe they implement some of the other changes later on? And the reason for that, gang, is because all of this has to happen at once. If the goal is to strongly encourage to spread their hooks in a reasonable manner, with emphasis on reasonable, then both incentives and disincentives have to come in place at the very same time. Why are incentives necessary? Because without incentives, the strategy of spreading hooks on its own doesn't reliably result in effective macro pressure against stronger coordinated survivors. They're either going to play the tiles very safely, they're going to take advantage of how many pallets that there are, they're going to have teammates who are constantly on generators, they may have someone rotated in a way when you're trying to tunnel out the teammate to where they're able to body block and then it extends the chase of the person that you're trying to tunnel. They're going to be making sure that your hook states go damn near 60 to 70 seconds every single time. All of that stuff, right? They're going to have very strong items, styptics, syringes, toolboxes with brand new parts. That is why we need to have incentives in place. If you're actually going to say with all of this shit that's in the game, you have to, despite all of that, take what is up to this point been suboptimal. You have to introduce incentives to make it optimal. But why are disincentives necessary? Because without disincentives, tunneling as a strategy could still remain optimal under niche or specific circumstances, especially if the incentives for spreading the hooks, such as the post-hook haste buff, could enable tunneling more easily due to a lack of disincentives existing as a countermeasure. So what does this mean in practice with respect to the PTB? In some of my matches that I did test, when I was going against some survivors that either would kind of greed some injuries early, or they just find themselves caught out of position when I was getting the post-haste buff after hooking a teammate, I would be able to get a very quick chase with a second survivor. I would hook that survivor, and because I technically had hooked a different survivor, I would be able to return to the hook in time, even though the hook aura was obscured, because with my game sense and the blocking of the aura, I remembered where I hooked, and I knew they were unhooking at that time, and they would likely still be there healing, if not especially because of the fact that the hook aura is blocked and obscured, so they would probably be confident that I probably wouldn't know that. But if I do, I now put them in a really difficult situation, because all the tunneled survivor has to rely on is they don't have aura reading, they don't have scratch marks, and I think they don't make sounds, right? They may or may not leave blood. I don't necessarily know off the top of my head, but forgive me on that, gang. The point being is that the survivor is not really in a good position, and at this point, They're kind of hoping I don't really misplay. Sure, they could play tiles better and they can play tiles properly utilizing these buffs, right? And these ways of making it harder for me to track them. But if they don't do that, what ends up happening is that, especially if they're not bringing anti-tunnel perks, because of these systems, they'd assume that they don't need to bring anti-tunnel perks. Well, now I'm downing them, I'm rehooking them, and then guess what, gang? Now I'm taking the post-haste buff from that survivor, and I'm going right back to the other hook. Remember survivor number 2? I'm going right back to survivor number 2. And what do you think is happening if they're healing under the hook as well? We're snowballing, we're repeating. And that, y'all, is also, we're going to also kind of talk about it if I haven't already. I think that is exactly the reason why they made it to where it was 6 hooks when it comes to the buffs that survivors were getting if you kill a survivor before that. And I think that's also why they also made it to where you can't just tunnel a survivor out directly. Because what happens if after hooking survivor 2 a second time, or even just not even hooking survivor 2, what if I just went away and then I just came back and tunneled survivor 1 again, right? I could have had survivor 1 dead at 5 hooks, probably even 1, 2, even probably even 4 hooks, right? I believe so. So that's kind of the whole point here. That is why you need disincentives as well as incentives, introduced at the exact same time in the very same patch. You introduce one without the other, you're going to introduce problems, right? What happens if there are disincentives without incentives? We talked about incentives without disincentives. If you have disincentives without incentives, then people just won't play the game. That's the reality there. Not really a whole lot needs to be said. I mean, y'all really kind of turn the gears in your head there. You make it to where killers can't camp or tunnel or proxy or any of that stuff when they reasonably need to do so, especially with regard to the lower tiers who are already struggling at a 1-to-4 ratio disparity of objective progress, chase/hook times versus generator repair speeds. And you mean to tell them that they can't even do the one strategy that even in some cases when survivors are bringing anti-tunnel perks and are coordinated and or play well in chase, that they'd even be able to accomplish to begin with, right? The strategy wouldn't even pan out in that case, even with that being the most optimal strategy, because of only disincentives. That is why you need both incentives and disincentives. But again, as I mentioned earlier, y'all, this shit ain't easy, right? It's not easy. The developers having a rough time doing it the first go around, should it really be that surprising for that reason, right? But that is why I think we are seeing everything happening at once. And going forward, this is that earlier point I was talking about just a few minutes ago. The developers understand this game better than y'all think. Remember, Dead by Daylight is not balanced around a player base on a 1-to-1 level of experience. It's not balanced around survivors with 2,000 hours going against a killer with 2,000 hours. It's balanced against survivors with 300 to 400 hours going against a killer with maybe 3,000 to 4,000, probably maybe even 5,000 hours, gang. Because the reality is a lot of survivors who play this game are extremely fucking casual. And I think I even talked about this in the next slide we're about to see. But y'all, a lot of people that play this game, they don't have a very intellectual understanding of it. The level of experience as well, just between the killer and the survivor, is sometimes so drastic that the developers have to design the game with respect to that. If you're going to more frequently than not have matches where survivors aren't on a similar level of experience to their opposition, you have to design the game in a way that keeps them playing. Because if you make the game too frustrating for the people, lack of experience, and you just tell them skill issue, haha, get better, they're just going to go fucking play Civilization. You know what I mean? Really think about it, right? Like, you have to respect people's time to some degree, and people view their time differently because time is obviously a unique and independent concept, but you have to kind of, because of that fact, make sure you're casting a net that captures enough people's time and makes it worth it. And again, because people aren't on that same level of experience, that's why you can't just default to skill issue. So this is why, going forward on this point, that is why survivors have periodically been given increasingly lenient comeback mechanics over the last few years. It's not because the role itself needs these mechanics. It's because the casual player base, due to that sporadic and drastic skill difference and experience difference between survivors and killers, the survivor players that play survivor predominantly more often than not need these buffs. They need these mechanics. This is also, again, y'all, to this point, remember the developers said right at the top that they were planning on making these changes a toggle in custom lobbies. They were very forward about that. It's almost as if they knew, hey gang, we know that a lot of y'all that do organized DBD or private matches, we know y'all are probably not going to like these changes. We know you're probably going to even think they're ridiculous. But maybe this should kind of give you a little bit of a bone here. This should kind of extend an olive branch that we know that y'all aren't going to like this and you won't have to deal with it. But hopefully maybe you kind of understand where we're coming from, right? Why these changes are being there to begin with, even if you don't like it. Again, in a lot of ways, it shouldn't affect you with like the way that they particularly enjoy DBD, privately custom games. But, you know, on that point too, when it comes to why the changes are coming out in public lobbies, why they're being restricted in custom lobbies, and the overall state of the balancing, right? Why I talked about this is specifically for the people who play Survivor, not the role itself. It's important to remember that in organized and competitive DBD custom lobbies, most rule sets, y'all, prevent survivors as a whole from running more than one of any perk that they're even allowed to run to begin with. So let's say, for example, that Lithe is allowed to be ran. Sometimes, y'all, you can't even take exhaustion perks for some killers, depending on what rule set or tournament we're talking about here. And what this means as a whole is if only one survivor can run Lithe, you know 3 other survivors won't have it. But could you imagine if all 4 survivors had Lithe? What if they all had brand new parts? What if they all had 4 styptics or syringes? What if 2 had syringes? What if 2 had styptics, right? There are so many levels, there's so many dynamic levels of the game that are otherwise put to the side in private DBD lobbies. And the reason for this, y'all, is again because of the balancing. When you look at organized competitive DBD, that understanding is there that people that are playing the game, they do have a similar level of hours and experience, right? We're talking about people that aren't just fresh home from work, right? They just, they don't know the difference between an L and a T and an L wall, you know, or a tile, 4-lane. Y'all, I'm getting my things backwards. You get what I'm saying? They don't know the difference between any of the different tiles on the map. They don't know the differences of the maps themselves that they're playing on. And as a result of that, they don't just get absolutely stomped in the process. The understanding is there of what survivors who are playing well can do, what killers who are playing well can do. And because of the sheer imbalance of the game, this is why we have to restrict survivors in such an extreme way. Because y'all, that is extreme. Even though killers have their own certain perk restrictions for some different reasons, right? The fact that survivors can't even run more than one of a perk, like you really need to like put into scope just how much, or just really think about how much that can just change the outcome of any match of Dead by Daylight in a public setting. And that's kind of my whole point there, right? That is when you look at a public setting and what is afforded to survivors in a public setting, it's not about overall balance, it's about what the survivors needed versus the killer. But I think we've really gone full scope there. We've gone really full circle. So now it's time, let's go forward here. You know, I think I kind of talked about, again, the survivors being really casual, but let's kind of go in a little bit more specifically on what I meant, because I did kind of reserve some slides for this. Now, yeah, the developers, I already said they don't balance the game at a 1-to-1 ratio. Let's see. Now, when it comes to how little survivors understand the game, just to kind of give y'all some examples, and that is kind of what I was going to talk about here. A lot of survivors, they say tunneling at 5 generators. If you have any understanding about Dead by Daylight, you should know that tunneling at 5 generators is literally statistically impossible. In order for a survivor to get tunneled at 5 generators, they basically have to get caught out immediately. They have to go down immediately. They have to have teammates that are unhooking them very soon after they were hooked, right? If you are playing a standard match of Dead by Daylight where a survivor pre-runs even just a little bit, if they play semi-safely dropping pallets, if their teammates are working on generators, even and especially if their teammates, let's say 20 to 30 seconds into the hook state, go for the unhook, it is literally impossible, even if the killer returns to tunnel immediately after the unhook happens, that you're going to be tunneled at 5 generators. You're probably going to be getting your second hook state maybe at 3 generators. Probably at worst for you, right? Maybe at 4 or 3.5, excuse me. You have the third one popped and the other one's almost done, and you're going to have partial progress on an additional generator before your other unhook happens. The point being, though, getting tunneled at 5 generators is literally a result of survivors as a whole not communicating or playing very well. And it is because of the whole fact that they say tunneling at 5 generators that kind of speaks to their lack of understanding. But again, that is my point, right? Their perspective matters because you have to keep them engaged in playing the game. Similarly, too, a lot of people are probably, this relates to this, but let's talk about pallets. Why is behavior looking to add more pallets to Dead by Daylight? It's very well understood that casual survivors are not good in chase. We just talked about this, and especially when it comes to the whole tunneling at 5 generators fiasco. This results, though, from two factors. One, casual survivors don't know what maps they're playing. Two, casual survivors don't know the tiles that they're playing. If you don't know the map that you're playing, so for example, let's say you loaded on Garden of Joy and all you understand about Garden of Joy is that it is spooky map with white house, right? It's got some white walls and there's some windows and some pallets outside, and I think I saw a truck. You know what I mean? If that is all a survivor understands about the map, they don't know that, okay, the main building has a really strong window in the back that connects and loops all the way down to a guaranteed pallet spawn at the front. And from there, you also have the killer shack in the back right corner that spawns there every single time. The pallet is also in the far back in the corner as well, and you can play that a little bit more safely because of that, right? All of this stuff. That's the difference there when it comes to knowledge that casual survivors do not have. Specifically when it comes to tiles, when you don't know the full strength of a tile and you're just throwing down your pallets inefficiently and safely, because way too safe, I might add, specifically because of the fact that you're just trying to preserve your health states, then what you result in is survivors who are playing their tiles suboptimally and they're not really making the most efficient use of their resources. So you add both of these two together, and that is why casual survivors are struggling in their chases. So when it comes to why behavior is looking to add more pallets, I believe this is simply because of the fact that if they know that survivors do not understand the maps that they're playing on, if they know that they're using their resources suboptimally and thus creating dead zones, then simply increasing more pallets on the map is going to make it to where they can use the pallets suboptimally, but they're still going to have pallets to work with, right? Which results in the fact that survivors are overall going to have longer chase times. Next, we're finally done with our observations, and I want to talk with y'all about some pros and cons. Starting first with the pros, these are the main benefits, in my opinion, that come with the proposed changes on the PTB. However, these aren't all good. I do have little, however, caveats at the bottom of each positive pro, simply because I do feel like they were a little bit off in their execution, right? We kind of talked about this, but it's not as if to say that everything with this patch was terrible. I really do like the direction the developers were taking the game, and I want to talk about that, right? The good and the bad, as well as afterward, the pros and the cons. We're going to talk about my solutions. So starting first with more creative freedom in who to chase. Previously, without Basekit incentives for spreading hooks, killers didn't have much of a reason to spread their hooks over tunneling a survivor out of the match. And this is because turning a 1v4 into 1v3 was universally always the better decision for creating macro pressure. For some weaker killers, and they were also pretty much reliant on this strategy to compensate for some flaw or capitalize on a strength within their kit. Clown, for example, Clown's flaw is he lacks in map mobility, but he has really, really good chase. So he capitalizes on the strength of being able to catch survivors out of position when he hooks them in an inopportune location, when he is able to pull survivors to that hook while he is also nearby. And it's also compensating for the fact that since he lacks in map mobility, he's not really able to do much with roaming the map after hooking each survivor. So that is kind of why previously camping and tunneling was really good for some killers, and thus going forward, right, you have to have Basekit incentives. So if the decision to tunnel no longer stems from alliance, then that means in essence, as I was saying, the killer has more creative freedom in who to chase and where they decide to go. So that is a result of the Basekit incentives is you get more creative freedom, and that is one thing I really do like about the changes, is that I don't have to feel as if I am relegated more to one area of the map, or I'm relegated to my generator cluster specifically. I'm able to hook a survivor, possibly catch a survivor out of position, and then I'm able to snowball to some degree a bit more off of that. And also further, because I have the Basekit instant regression, I'm able to just get Basekit value out of that too by kicking any generators on a different side of the map that I was roaming to that I otherwise previously wouldn't have been, because I wouldn't have had both the mobility or even probably the instant regression to do that. So again, as a however to this, I'm not 100% certain if the numbers are in the right place. I'm not sure if they either need to add more quality of life tools as a whole that are probably different from haste and or aura reading and or even Basekit instant regression, right? I do think that aura intensity on generators to know specifically how much progress is on a generator is something that killers need in some fashion, whether it's through a perk, whether it's through Basekit. That is a lot more helpful than seeing a survivor's aura itself, I feel like, in some ways. So that could be a consideration, but if not that, I'm also not sure if they don't need more than 10% haste for 15 seconds. Maybe it would need to be 15% or something. I'm not thinking of Clown when I say this, y'all. Think about Trapper, right? Think about Ghostface, maybe even. There's a lot of killers out there that don't have any way of increasing their movement speed, and they're relying on pure 4.6. And that is where I think having greater haste values could help these killers to consider leaving the hook, right? It would function as a better incentive. Similarly, 20% instant regression feels pretty good. I will say it does feel pretty good, especially since that does stack, I believe, with the 5% instant, right? So you've got 5% maximum progress, I meant to say, alongside 20% current progress. That's some pretty good Basekit regression, so that might be okay. So I just wanted to clarify, right? As much as it feels great to have this creative freedom, the numbers I think do maybe need some adjustment. Further to building off of the Basekit instant regression and the haste, I feel like there's more perk variety. When previously you had to run, it felt like 2 to 3, maybe even 4 generator perks, or you had to run 1 chase perk, 3 generator perks, or maybe a perk to specifically counter tunneling, or to help you with tunnel, I mean, or also probably bringing corrupt intervention. That's also a perk slot, right? There are so many different ways that killer players would find themselves limited in their perk slots by virtue of the fact that they just had to take certain perks, right? So giving Basekit instant regression, giving Basekit haste, this creates perk variety, since by virtue of the fact that you're getting a lot of this benefit at base, you now don't need to take maybe 1 or even more of these perks. And further, you look at the haste also, right? That means that you're getting a little bit something extra in chase. That probably means because you don't bring as much instant regression. This is also, I think, going to build into a different slide too, by the way, talking about perk and Basekit variety. But yeah, you can also, with the haste, you can look to, because you have instant regression, you can then stack that with the haste perk. And that is one thing I really liked about this, is that because of both instant regression and haste / mobility and aura reading, we're seeing more perk variety now in our kits. And honestly, y'all, it feels really, really good. You know, the last time I feel like any role had such an influence made to its base kit and its perk variety was back when survivors were given borrowed time base kit. I did include reassurance as well on there because I do really feel like with the 10 extra second added to hook timers that reassurance hasn't been nearly as necessary as it used to be back when it was first added. But looking at borrowed time as the most notorious example, it used to be back in the day to where if you didn't have borrowed time, your teammates would not have any protection if you unhooked them, or if someone who didn't have borrowed time unhooked them, and you wouldn't have endurance if your teammate didn't have borrowed time and you unhooked you, or they unhooked you. Excuse me, gang. And that felt really, really awful being in that position, right? Coming off of the hook without endurance, since many killers would gamble on the fact that your teammate may or may not have borrowed time if they're tunneling, and if they didn't have borrowed time, then it really would work out as a massive macro swing in their favor, since being able to down someone without borrowed time, you could then rehook them. You could play off of that efficiency in a much better way when it comes to overall macro pressure. And this is kind of why, following this, behavior went through making it base kit. This meant that survivors now don't need to run borrowed time as a perk slot, and this perk slot you're able to use for literally anything that you want. And with respect to probably some other necessary perks or some other bases that need to be covered, making this base kit helped the survivors do that as well. So you really just think about making more quality of life changes, or just, if you could call it that. I do think that when it comes to killers who lack an instant regression or who need macro pressure, right, I guess you could look at Basekit instant regression as a quality of life change. But yeah, the same point really does stand here, in that in the same way that borrowed time was made Basekit to where survivors didn't need to run borrowed time, well, now by making some instant regression base kit, killers don't necessarily need to run as much instant regression or slowdown in their perk builds. So kind of that's what I also rebuffed here when it comes to borrowed time and reassurance functioning as instant regression. But continuing on that point, I do also want to talk about the synergistic nature that exists between Basekit instant regression, or really any and all instant regression, right? Also just generator slowdown, but non-generator perks and information perks too. all perks, believe it or not, to some degree, do have some form of synergy between them, right? Even if they aren't of the same type. And this is because when you look at instant regression, both the base kit and perks, many of them require you to have a successful chase. You look at Pop Goes the Weasel. What does Pop Goes the Weasel require? It requires you to down and hook a survivor. Pain Resonance, down and hook a survivor. Surge, down a survivor, right? Every single one of these perks. Eruption, down a survivor. Every perk. Grim Embrace, hook a survivor. Dead Man Switch, hook a survivor. This is one of the issues when it came to killers beforehand, is that they didn't have really anything at all when it comes to instant regression. So they need to run these perks in order to actually help them out in the macro. But because they're running all of these perks and they aren't afforded or feel like they're afforded the opportunity to run perks that would give them faster chases, right? Whether that's information perks so they start their chases sooner, help them play certain high wall tiles, or chase perks like haste perks so they're able to finish their chases faster, right? By virtue of not running these latter perks, the category in the yellow, and stocking so much on in the green because they needed that for the macro pressure, they weren't actually seeing the results from the slowdown and the regression because their chases aren't coming in an efficient manner, right? It doesn't matter if you destroy a generator for 18 million% instant regression progress if it takes you 3 minutes to actually down a survivor, right? Because by that time, you're going to lose 2 to 3 generators. It doesn't matter if you literally could take it from 90% to 0 in a single hook. So that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make here, is making some instant regression instant, making it to where you're able to run some of these other perks. There's a synergy there that results in you getting more value out of the instant regression by virtue of having faster chases. So that's also really important to take into account. But again, just as I mentioned, right, even though there is some more creative freedom when it comes to your perk variety and also your decision on who to chase, the problem with this is that there is still a lack of comeback mechanics, right? So you are still spreading your hooks. You are encouraged to do so with the Basekit instant regression and with the haste and the information, but all of this together still isn't helping you when you fall behind in a match. And that is why I'm not really so sure if, as great as it all feels, right, and as much as it does help killer in the ways that they need, if it's still accomplishing the goal is proper incentives to where spreading hooks is competing with survivors that are playing efficient in macro. Does that make sense? Even with the perk variety, even with the base kit, playing back into the previous point, I'm still not sure if the execution is enough. Next, making killer less stressful to play. By virtue of expanding creative freedom on who a killer player is reasonably able to chase, the killer role as a whole becomes less stressful to play. I feel like this is pretty much a given. One of the most frustrating parts about playing killer is feeling like you need to hyper fixate on everything that you were doing within the match. Everything from where you spawned in, where you start and take your first chase, where survivors are probably going to be, whether you need to kick certain doors, after you hook your first survivor, where you need to go afterward, where you need to, whether you need to proxy the hook because you're not able to really follow up on any generators that are being worked on from that first hook that you got to begin with, right? There are so many different layers to playing Dead by Daylight, or specifically Killer, I should say, that are very, very stressful. And by virtue of expanding creative freedom, since you're not locked into certain strategies, if you really want to be playing optimally, this means that you're kind of able to like take a bit of, it takes some weight off your shoulders, right? It's now, there's probably only going to be more attention on how well you play in chase compared to how well you're playing in macro. And while this does, to some degree, it takes away from the game knowledge and the skill expression that comes from that for killer players. Again, right, the whole point is that stress, right? If we're looking at making killer less stressful, there are 2 layers of stress that come from the previous system, when there was less creative freedom. And that was due to a stress from lack of agency and a stress from what little agency that there was to begin with being so delicate. You had to make sure you were really doing what you could. In other instances, you couldn't really do anything, which just felt really, really terrible, right? So hopefully I'm looking that if this is executed properly in the future, they are able to do so in a way where this freedom exists, but in a way where it's it doesn't take away too much from the skill expression through game knowledge. Do you get what I'm saying? And that is something that, another thing too, I want to point out when it comes to skill expression or even just decision making, right? Even though the pro is that the creative freedom makes the game less stressful, since this freedom does come with the disincentives we were talking about earlier, since without the disincentives, then you still have tunneling existing as an opportunistic decision. The disincentives can make it really problematic for killers to come back in situations where they do need to return the hook, to the hook. They probably do need to tunnel the survivor, right? Because either the Basekit instant regression isn't enough, they weren't able to capitalize off of the information from the R reading, they weren't able to capitalize off of the haste that they got from that hook, and so not being able to do so, right, unironically, functions as similarly as well as a form of lacking in creative freedom. Now, before we go on to the cons, I want to lastly do a little bit more talking about Perk and Basekit synergy that comes with the quality of life changes. And what I do like, I know we talked about how there's perk variety, but looking specifically at synergy, since we are getting haste, right, you're able to do some fun stuff with that. I've been really like running Furtive Chase and Friends to the End on Clown, for example, because with Furtive Chase, I get 10% haste for 15 seconds whenever, no, it's 18 seconds whenever I hook the Obsession. So I take the 10% haste for 18 seconds, I stack that with the 10% haste for 15 seconds, and then I stack that with Clown's Yellow Bottles, and now I'm moving at a whopping 35% speed. A lot of survivors don't see it coming, especially with the lack of that terror radius, and with Friends to the End giving me a new Obsession target, I know where I could be going. I know that I'm going to get Furtive Chase as well when I down and hook that Obsession. And it just creates this really, really cool dynamic loop that now exists because of that Basekit 10% haste. Because sure, I could still run this perk build before this PTB, right? So I wouldn't have that 10% haste from that Basekit, the Basekit buff. But at the same time, it's just not going to be as fun, Yeah, it's cool and it still works, but it's even better. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that there is probably, since there is for Clown, I would imagine for other killers this is also true. And it is nice to kind of see that, right? So that's just one thing I just wanted to talk about. Next, we're going to be looking at some cons and some negatives that come with these changes. These are more specifically on the downsides. This isn't like we're looking at some downsides and some positives. These are the really, really big issues that exist with this system, and it's something that I think needs to get the most attention. But again, keep in mind, this is my opinion, but these are things that I really think matter a lot here. First things first, falling behind early still is no solution. Although these changes potentially increase creative freedom over a killer is reasonably able to chase without falling behind in macro pressure due to the decision of taking that chase alone, at best, this is only going to be true insofar that the killer player is not making mistakes during those chases. So what I'm getting at is that it feels as if you do have the creative freedom if you play really well in chase, you find a survivor caught out early. This is more my perspective, and again, I know I wasn't playing on the PTB against super extreme high-level survivors, right? But in the matches that I was playing on a more PTB-ish, or not PTB-ish, excuse me, public match-ish, casual type-ish of setting, right? It felt as if with the haste, with the instant regression, basically freeing up that perk slot in essence, right? I had the freedom to just go for different chases with different survivors. But here's the thing. Once I started making mistakes, if I was running a build that didn't have corrupt, and I was going, 3 to 4 chase builds, or chase perks, so I was only relying on the Basekit instant regression, then it really did hurt. Because when survivors were repairing their generators, when I couldn't down my second survivor after the first and I had to cut my losses and look for another chase, I was guaranteed losing 2 generators because of that. And by that point, right, with how just survivor 1v4 objective efficiency compared to killer chase efficiency, especially when we're talking about a killer who lacks in macro mobility, it just still becomes unsalvageable. And that's kind of the issue here, right? Not only is it that I fall behind because I made mistakes in chase, but I can't come back from that. And it makes me feel as if I wish I could camp and tunnel, right? But that's the thing. I still can't do that. So not only am I playing into freedom, the freedom doesn't feel good because it's not getting me anywhere. And That's really what matters, right? People play killer for the bigger picture in the grand scheme. Most people don't log on to killer to get 1 or 2 kills. People are looking to look to kill the majority of the survivors. And so when you can't come back from that, the freedom doesn't really matter, is what I'm trying to say. So that's something that the developers really need to look at. I think there needs to be something that enables killers to come back when they fall behind. And if we're not talking about killers coming back when they fall behind during the generator phase, one idea that there is personally, which I think would be best, is that hook states should contribute toward an in-game purpose once all the generators are completed. And we'll be talking about that in just a little bit. Next, let's talk about, this is basically what I was just saying, hooks lack a now necessary in-game goal. So literally a continuation. If one of the main expectations or takeaways of the changes is that survivors will at minimum be alive for a longer period of their matches on average, then killer players also need to be equipped for the situations where their matches reach the post-generator phase under these circumstances. So really think about how a match plays out differently depending on whether or not the killer reaches the post-generator phase when you've got 4 survivors alive, 3 survivors alive, 2 survivors alive, right? The more survivors that are alive when all generators are repaired changes radically how a killer needs to play out a match. It changes whether or not he's able to defend certain hooks and whether or not he can camp, right? It changes whether or not he's even able to get the win to begin with. When you're looking at 2 survivors remaining, specifically when all the generators are repaired, it is basically a win. He only needs to find 1 survivor and camp that. So on average, if survivors are living longer, which means on average more survivors are going to be alive in the end game, then killers are going to need a way to come back either from this, right, during the generator phase, or we create a goal in the end game where these spread hook phases contribute toward a bigger purpose, right? If the grand scheme of our hooks is not taking a survivor out of the match, then the grand scheme needs to be, I'm getting a benefit from spreading my hooks so I can kill the survivors later. The end game is arguably the shortest and most volatile stage of the match, in addition to being the most difficult for the killer to maintain, depending on how many survivors are still alive. If killers are going to be regularly reaching end game with multiple survivors still alive during the trial at this stage, following the changes, then there needs to be a mechanic that rewards them for spreading the hooks successfully during what is otherwise the shortest stages of the match. So that is basically just my opinion on what I think about the state of the game going forward with the developers' changes to hooking, right? Both spreading hooks and disincentivizing camping and tunneling. I think that this now becomes even more necessary. Now, this next point is just semantics, but I do think it matters a lot, especially when you look at the casual killer player base. And this is that even though people do log on to killer for the purpose of the game of, right, when you're the killer, you want to kill survivors, and you not just want to kill survivors, you want to kill the majority of the survivors because that's winning, right? Well, how you accomplish this matters too, especially since you're playing the power role. And the more behavior puts in disincentives that essentially restrict the killer's ability to accomplish a win through certain strategies, this is almost in essence taking away from the power that the killer role has and making it feel as if you're not a killer, you're a servant, right? Because within the realm of DBD, as the killer, you are a killer only insofar and the entity lets you accomplish that. If the entity says, you can't kill that survivor because I'm going to give them elusive, I'm going to give them an extra health state, I'm going to make it to where if you kill them, then you're going to be hit with massive penalties, this, that, and the other, all of this stuff to where you really can't and or shouldn't be doing this, then you're like, it's almost like, okay, master, whatever you say, you know? Like, I thought I was a killer, but apparently I'm just meant to do what you want me to do, you know? And some people might like this. Some people may see past this. They don't care about the atmosphere or the influence that it has on that, right? And being restricted in the power role in this way. But for a lot of people, dude, they're probably just going to think it feels terrible. They're going to feel like that they don't really have the power that they thought that they had. And again, putting emphasis on how this affects casual players, if you aren't really able to make the most out of these Basekit mechanics, if the incentives don't really lead you to the goal of winning your matches in this way, right? So you only really feel the brunt of the disincentives, then yeah, you're feeling like you're a servant, you're feeling like you're lacking in power, and you're probably not going to want to play the game. And or at least you're not going to want to play killer, right? You're going to want to almost, in a way, some people might feel like they want to play survivor because unironically, all of the power that they had to face as the killer that put them on the back burner, that basically limited them to such a degree, they're going to feel like, well, survivor must be the power role. So that is one thing I do think that does kind of matter. And I want to put emphasis on that, right? It kind of matters because at the end of the day, if the health of the game does come from making it to where survivors who are also casual aren't getting caught out early, getting put on their first hook, not having any breathing room once they get put off hook, and then having to get put immediately back into chase because the killer's tunneling them, right? It's a balancing measure, and it's not something that you can just easily solve. I just am bringing attention here from the killer's perspective, right? It's like, yeah, we're making it to where survivors that are casual have their breathing room, but by virtue of that, through the disincentives, especially for casual killers who probably don't make the most out of the base kit for them, for spreading those hooks, they're probably going to be looking at this with this view, with this mindset, right? This mindset of, I'm not really a killer anymore. I'm a servant. You know what I mean? So next point two, going from here, and this is also really matters a lot, gang. The forced amnesty with the current implementation of these disincentive changes has extreme potential for abuse. And this is probably one of the worst parts about the change too. I think this is why everyone is freaking the hell out, you know, because if things went through as they were specifically designed, oh my gosh, survivors, once they optimize it, they're going to have a field day. And again, right, this boils down to with how beforehand, right, when you look at how killers were already behind in their 1v4, if the incentives don't put killers with their ability to spread hooks above the macro pressure that they got from camping and tunneling, this means that you take the forced amnesty that comes from survivors who know that they can't be rehooked. What we were seeing a lot of survivors do is they were just sitting on generators. They were making themselves exposed and out in the open because they knew the killer wouldn't pressure them. And that is also basically the problem, is what I'm getting at that came with these forced amnesty changes, is that while this might be intelligent gameplay and team coordination, it's also completely against the spirit when it comes to the changes and why they were implemented to begin with. And I also think it would contribute significantly to, as I mentioned earlier, it contributes significantly to why people just resent the direction the developers are taking the game by principle. Because it's like, yeah, we're trying to help casual survivors, but by virtue of helping the casual survivors with this system, we are also enabling the really strong and capable survivors, people who do understand the game well, right? They're going to go so far with the disincentives that they are just going to make it to where other killers, they aren't going to be able to counter it, right? So that's another really important point too. Probably the most important part of the downsides that came with these changes is the specific implementation and how they could be abused. Next, I want to talk about a topic that I've seen floated around in a few spaces online. I've seen some people suggest that if you simply reduce the hook counter from 6 down to 4, that this probably wouldn't be as much of an issue when it comes to the developer's current implementation. And while that is technically true, there are two problems with that fly in the face of why we're seeing this change to begin with. Namely, for one thing, killers have an issue with falling behind. And when it comes to reducing the hook counter from 6 to 4, you're not really helping the manner of falling behind. You're just giving yourself an out, or at least a ways to maybe come back into the match. But when you look at the specifics of even 6 to 4, for a lot of killers, especially on the mid to lower tier end, you're already too far behind to come back from that. And further, one of the other issues is the whole point is killers are not to really at all be tunneling or camping to begin with. So when you say reduce the hook counter from 6 to 4, you're not really at all solving the problem that you were intending to solve, right? If anything, you're enabling it because you're saying, well, actually, it's okay under these circumstances. You're now just creating a justification, right? So this doesn't actually fix the issue of both falling behind and or stopping killers from the behaviors. It's just more, if anything, what you're doing is you're pulling the ladder up from all of the other killers who aren't going to be able to cope with a 4 hook requirement before they're allowed to camp and tunnel. It's going to be a situation where you hook your first survivor, you're going to get your spread hook incentive, you're going to look to kick a generator, maybe start a chase with your bonus haste. You're not going to be able to facilitate that effectively. Survivors are going to be able to take you to a tile, or they're going to waste your time. You're now going to be looking to having to play more effectively into your hooks, but this could not even happen in your first chase. It could happen on your second or your third, probably even your fourth, right? But you're going to be so far gone, or at least with respect to the idea of it being 4 hooks. Let's even assume it's your third chase, right? I digress. The point being is that you're going to be so far gone in macro pressure because you're going to be looking to taking these spread hook chases that never materialized into any other hooks spread across other survivors. So you're not going to meet that 4 hook condition. You get what I'm saying? That's really the issue with even this. It's not solving the problem of falling behind. And again, you're just enabling a behavior that is a problem that is looking to have been solved with the system to begin with. So going forward, right? That is why I've been saying, especially throughout this video, I feel like the way you combat this problem with the developer system is that not only does it need to be implemented better when it comes to the numbers, especially when it comes to some of the contingencies, right? But I also think the hooks themselves need to build toward something. If you make it to where survivors are not getting taken out of a match, but at the same time, the hooks on them create an ever-present threat that will snowball to the point where it climaxes, right? Possibly when all the generators are done. Now suddenly killers that aren't actually killing survivors, but are at least to some degree are hooking them, they're able to fare more at a stage of the game where they are also going to struggle. And that is why I've spent a fair bit of time kind of working on my own system personally, right? This is a solution that I've come up with, which is meant to expand upon Behavior's previous system that they pushed onto the PTB. And I've got some points here that we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be going into pretty good depth about my system here because I've been really thinking a lot about the game and when it comes to the game's issues. And particularly, I think when it comes to Dead by Daylight, especially Killer, one of the biggest problems with the game is the end game. The end game really does feel as if not only is it lacking, but unless you've already won won by then, you're not going to be winning, right? So unless you have 2 kills before all the generators are being completed, you're likely not going to be having anything really consistent beyond that, because if you only have 1 kill and you're competing for your second, you're now having to deal with the altruistic end game with all of the Basekit perks, also the potential for hooks being placed really close to the exit gates themselves, making the hooks almost guaranteed escapes, right? There are many levels of nuance that otherwise just become really problematic simply by virtue of the fact that you did not win your match by endgame. Right? So that's why I really do think that when you look at how the developers are wanting us to spread our hooks, right? Perhaps instead of looking at it as the end game, no pun intended, or rather the main objective of hooking survivors is to take them out of the match, perhaps that can be just one goal, and a second can be just simply accumulating hook states, and you could gain a buff that you could then take into the end game, and that could probably be what allows you to get some kills and maybe even win the match, right? All things considered, really circumstantial when it comes to how Dead by Daylight plays out, with every match being so dynamic and different, right? But let's talk about how the system that I've been leading up to this point, let's talk about how it would function in practice. Depending on the number of survivors who have been hooked twice but are still alive when all 5 generators have been fully repaired, I propose that certain bonuses could activate during the in-game phase that would make the killer stronger. Here are some threatening examples that I had in mind. Once all 5 generators have been fully repaired, if there is at least 1 survivor who has been hooked twice, and I want to put emphasis on that, hooked twice, then the killer gains a permanent 5% haste. If there are 2 survivors who have been hooked twice, all pallets and windows are blocked for 45 seconds. If 3 survivors have been hooked twice, all survivor auras are permanently revealed. Yes, I know that's a really big benefit. And lastly, if all survivors have been hooked twice, and again, we're saying twice as in they're still alive in the trial, right? So this is a very specific condition here. then every survivor, or it's not every survivor, excuse me, each survivor that is downed by the killer during the endgame phase is instantly sacrificed, and further, all lockers are permanently blocked by the entity. Now, some people might be wondering, why do you want to block the lockers? Because I do feel like when you look at earning this reward, right, hooking every single survivor in the trial twice without killing any survivor, that is something that is not going to happen very often. It is something that I feel like it's the way I kind of see it is I see it kind of like Pentimento, right? You know how getting the 5 stacks of Pentimento is seldom ever going to happen. Even Devour Hope, getting the 5 stacks of Devour doesn't really happen all too much. I kind of see the system in that same way. And given that it encourages killers to not kill survivors, which means that survivors spend more time in their matches actually playing the game, right? That's the biggest complaint that a lot of people have, is that they're not playing the game. Well, this system would directly encourage that. You're going to be playing the game, but the game's not just going to be free once all the generators are completed, right? If the killer did a good job spreading his hooks, which means he's chasing you and your teammates, and he's actually winning his chases and doing well, then you've got to contend with the system that could still get you killed. So that's why I propose, if you literally manage to hook every single survivor in the trial without killing anybody twice when all generators are completed and they're all still in the trial, yes, if you down a survivor, instantly sacrifice them. Have the entity just straight up shoot up out of the ground and hit them with the twist and break all their limbs. Take them out of the trial, which means the killer doesn't have to pick them up and hook them. He can start looking for other survivors. And let me tell you, this would be crazy. I would really, really love to see this. Especially, again, with the lockers being blocked, there's no hiding, gang. There's no hiding. And again, the lockers aren't even so much about blocking the hiding. It's because of the whole interaction with instantly sacrificing a survivor when they get downed. You're not just forcing a locker grab into a hook. This is literally, if the killer earns this, he earns this. He's able to see your aura. You better make sure he doesn't down you. And again, another thing I want to point out, I didn't put anything in my suggestions relating to making the chases faster through anything just beyond blocking windows or pallets. There's no instant downs, right? There's nothing cheesy that just instantly gets you killed. There's nothing that's even slowing you, right? It's just simply, oh, you can't use some windows or pallets, and also the killer's going to know where you're at, and if he finds you, you're going down, right? But that is kind of just, this is the foundation that of what I really think when it comes to the direction of wanting killers to spread their hooks without actually killing survivors. This is where I think the game needs to go. If the game doesn't go in a direction beyond just simply, I'm hooking survivors simply for the purpose of killing them, well, what happens is when killers aren't able to kill survivors, well, now they aren't getting toward there's no bigger picture that's being accomplished there, right? They're not actually realizing anything. And in a lot of situations, I do feel like that's why a lot of people just give up in their matches. When a match becomes lost and they don't really feel like there's any point coming back, why continue to play, you know? But going forward, let's also talk about this system and how it expands onto behaviors, you know, direction that they were taking the game with this recent PTB. And actually, I really feel like I already just did that. Yeah, we spent a whole lot of time doing this, so we don't even need to talk about this slide, I feel like, much at all. Going forward, though, I do feel like there needs to be some potential readjustment for some in-game perks, right? Now, if y'all notice when I did, I think I also did briefly mention this too when we were talking about this, but I want to reiterate. None of the changes that I have in mind here are about elongating the in-game phase. When I think about the post-generator phase, the endgame of Dead by Daylight, I think of a very high stakes and volatile phase of the game. This is something that's not meant to last long. This is meant to be probably, if I were honest, gang, I feel like the endgame phase in a healthy match should be over in 2 to 3 minutes at best. And, you know, 2 to 3 minutes, by the way, drags on when there's a lot of shit going on, right? So I feel like it should be 2 to 3 minutes at best, even possibly with in-game perks, which is why I feel like we probably should readjust some perks like Remember Me or No Way Out, because, I mean, y'all, let's really think about it, right? When it comes to the idea of spreading 8 hooks across 4 survivors for an S-tier killer, if they're running full endgame, they literally will create hell on earth when it comes to that endgame phase. And it's like, it's a way where I feel like it would be, it would be too obscene, right? Too unbearable. So maybe adjust those two perks just with consideration of what the really high echelon of killers can accomplish. But right, when you consider if the endgame phase is fast paced, then what that means is that even when you consider the very best case scenario, all 4 survivors being hooked twice, it's very impractical that that's going to mean all 4 survivors get killed. Because when exit gates take 16 seconds to open, gang, and they're probably split across the map, and it's not as if the system gives you a teleportation ability, right? You still have to contend with the fact that you may or may lack in map mobility. And also because I purposefully didn't put anything in there to give you instant down if your kit doesn't have it, that means that you potentially have to deal with 2 health states, right? You still have to deal with pre-running, which also builds into the to the lack of map mobility. Not to die, like get too distracted, but y'all really get where I'm going here, right? Is that when it comes to your ability to stall out even the worst extreme of the system, downing you instantly upon, or instantly sacrificing you upon getting downed, it's unlikely for a lot of killers that they would be able to do that with how the timing of the exit gates currently are. That's kind of what I'm trying to say here, right? You can have 8 hooks spread across 4 survivors, but with pre-running, maps, exit gate spreads, and all of that jazz, 2 survivors are still getting out of the trial. You probably in a reasonable expectation, I would say 2 survivors, because you're going to down one, you're going to be looking to down the other. He's probably not going to get out the gate. Maybe he's headed toward the gate right when he gets downed, and then that gate is open probably when that second trace was transpiring, and then the other 2 survivors are out that door, right? When you consider that in this proposed scenario, survivors aren't going to be looking at altruism. They're not going to be looking to prepare to unhook other teammates. They're not going to be looking for totems or things like that. They're not going to be doing anything else besides opening the exit gate as well and getting out the trial. That not only plays what I'm talking about, the match being fast, but again, it's not like just because you did all of these things that it's an I win button. It's an I win mechanic. You win. It just gives you something to look forward to, because y'all, it really does suck playing killer and feeling like the only means of actually winning the trial and hooking survivors in general is to kill them and take them out of the trial, because y'all, if you can't fucking do that, you're not getting anything done. Literally, it's like, why play the game? I want to reiterate, right? This gives you a reason to play the game, because even if you're not killing survivors, if you've got something to look forward to when all the gens are popped, because you know they're now going to all get popped, well then keep playing, see what happens, right? So again, maybe adjust some numbers to remember me no way out so they're not oppressive, but that's really what I like, how all of this comes together with just how I feel like the timing of the game should be. Again, consider that just because you get these benefits, it's not as if the killer just automatically wins, assuming that the end game itself is fast-paced. And lastly, what I want to talk about here, just to kind of pull everything together, I know that sometimes, y'all, I do want to real quick kind of clarify. I don't mean to over-repeat myself, but, I just always want to make sure that when it comes to certain things that I'm coming full circle and I'm really pulling all of the details together. Lastly, though, let's just talk a little bit about lore. I'm not a big lore guy myself, but given that the lore does kind of matter when it comes to atmosphere, and I did spend a little bit of time talking about the contrast between the atmosphere of being seen as a servant and being seen as a killer, right? It's one thing to be a servant and to feel as if that you are literally the second class, like you are beneath the others. But if you are a servant and you are going to at some point become empowered, right? Because again, we're talking about servant in context of the power role. The power role is meant to be above, right? So if you are going to take a position of being inferior at some point of the trial because the entity, right, who controls your ability is limiting you, him taking off those chains because you abide by principle, I feel like that fits the lore very well. It's literally as if the entity is saying, okay, I told you not to kill survivors too quickly. You didn't do that. You spread your hooks, right? You played into what I wanted you to do, and it's now time to do your job, right? All of the generators are done, and survivors are now looking to get out. Make sure that doesn't happen, right? Especially in line, again, with how well you did everything leading up to that point. And I believe a big part of DBD lore-wise too is about terror. It's about hope. It's about feeling as if there's, it's about, I think when it comes to the perspective of Survivor, it was about you want them to feel like there's still a chance, right? So when you spread all of the hook, you spread all of that terror equally across the Survivor team, and then it's as if they have that hope that they're going to get out because everyone's still alive. Giving Killer an overwhelming level of power during a very short stage of the game to where it's like you can get out because the phase is so short, but similarly, the Killer is now so powerful that you need to make sure you get out because otherwise he will kill you. You know, I really do like that. It's different than being a servant and being told it's like, nah, you're because the contrast is it's like you're a babysitter, right? I've seen many people look at the system on the PTB. They literally refer to it as like the Killer's a babysitter now. Like I saw the gold star versus the bad star comparison. If you're doing good, the hook counters gold, and then if you start getting bad hooks, I think it like is no longer gold anymore, something like that. You know what I mean? So it's like that is literally, I think, without the incentives leading towards something. We're talking about just the Basekit instant regression and the Basekit haste. It needs to be more than that. It's like the Basekit haste and the instant regression should help you get more hooks. But then those hooks at the end of the game should help you get kills. That's what I think, right? Because until that happens, unless you can find a solution for the fact that even if you incentivize killers to spread their hooks, that they are still going to fall behind, and now we need to do something about that, right? If you don't do something about killers falling behind, then they're not going to be able to win their matches, and then they're not going to want to play the game. They're going to find it too frustrating, and hopefully now we've come full circle with why people had such an issue. So maybe my changes help. I hope y'all liked my TED Talk. A whole lot to say here, gang, and one of my biggest concerns that I had, again, with making this video is I did not want to over-repeat myself, y'all, but it's like I really wanted to be so detailed when it came to my thoughts here because, honestly, I'm really passionate about this. Specifically like this, y'all, I really do think about how my matches would feel if I were having a rough match. Because, y'all, I have a lot of matches where things just kind of go to the wayside after my first or second chase, y'all. And I've played 7,000 plus matches of Clowns, so it's like after all of those matches, knowing that I just can't come back. If y'all have ever watched my stream and you've seen, like, the last couple of weeks, y'all, probably even the last month or so, I've not been having nearly as much fun at all with Dead by Daylight. I've also been under a lot of real life stress, and I don't ever talk about that shit, y'all. It's been months, and it's been way too long going. And that's especially one of the reasons why I especially don't like talking about what goes on with me, because I don't like it ever being seen as an excuse or something to kind of deflect onto, right? But just overall, when it comes to just the game, going back to what I was saying, and it comes to my matches, it's like I just get so frustrated nowadays because it's like I've played 7,000 games. I can tell when a match is lost, and when I refer to a match in the context of being lost, it's that unless the survivors literally throw like so blatantly and give me the win, I'm not coming back from that, right? So when I just know through all of my experience that a match is lost and that I reasonably can't come back, and I feel like I'm spinning my wheels in a manner of speaking, it's like I'm just grinding the dirt and not getting anywhere, then it just really fucking sucks. It feels so terrible. It feels so frustrating. And if I just had in my mind the thought that if I just keep playing this game out, even though the survivors that I'm chasing are not going to get killed, the generators are going to be getting completed, but perhaps I can spread the hooks and I can accumulate enough hooks by the time the generators are completed that I'm going to be able to get a boon or a benefit during the in-game phase, and now I can maybe win the match. Maybe, right? And if I don't win the match, I'll probably still end up with a kill or two more than I would otherwise, because if I'm not going to kill the survivors anyways before the generators are completed, tunneling or not, having something to look forward to on top of the hook states that I would be getting anyways, right, without the benefit, means that by virtue of that, I'm still going to be doing better. And I know that there are still people out there who don't like this direction that behavior could take the game. And for that reason, right, especially those that do play Dead by Daylight in more organized or competitive environments, or maybe even casual environments where they just don't like dealing with these systems or these changes that kind of more guide how you play the game. They could simply tie everything together as a toggleable setting in custom lobbies and make it to where you say, I don't want to deal with these system changes, right? You could call it a doom system, call it whatever you want, but the point being is you check the box, and this makes it to where if killers tunnel survivors, they don't have to deal with elusive. They don't have to deal with generators getting permanently blocked if they kill someone early, right? They could even come up with toggles as well, which I really think they should. They should come up with toggles for other forms of base kit. So base kit borrowed time could even be toggled off. I think they could do that. They could also make it to where the anti-camp meter could be toggled off. Maybe even add different settings for hook timers as a whole. Make it to where you could make your hook timers shorter, right? All of this, especially with how they have kind of given a little bit of attention to making a distinction between custom matches of Dead by Daylight, especially competitive, and public matches. I do think this would also be something good that they could do, and it would also satisfy two different parts of the player base, because there really are a pretty good amount of good-sized people that play mostly custom games. They don't play Dead by Daylight in public lobbies. So if you were to make this a toggleable setting, right, for custom lobbies, this would be like literally almost changing the entire game for them. It's not as if that they have to deal with the changes that are meant for a more casual player base by proxy in their custom lobbies. They can do their own little thing in their own little corner. You get what I mean? So I really, really do like that. And it's why, especially, you look at everything together, it ties really, really well with the game as a whole, regardless of who you are, how skilled you are at the game, or just how you choose to play it. So, I think that's just about everything I do want to say here today. There's going to be no gameplay footage. I'm going to be probably talking about Clown in its own video when I get to that. Probably soon. We'll have to see, gang. I know I've been very dormant. I've been very away when it comes to my videos. Again, this one in particular, y'all, I do want to apologize. I do feel like it could have been handled a lot better. I feel like the content of this video reads better than it listens, so that's one of the reasons too. I'm also going to have a link to the presentation in my comments. But I hope y'all really, really like this. I do give a lot of love and respect to the devs, gang. Well, to wrap things up, the devs have a really rough go about dealing with this game. I don't envy the shit they have to deal with, and I just want to give them the best for the game going forward, right? I want them to do the best with this game. I want things to be better for everyone, not just Killer, but Survivor too, right? Even though I play very viciously sometimes, very ruthlessly, it's not like I don't care about the people that I'm playing against. You know what I mean? I've always tried to make sure I've made that clear. But if y'all really liked this video and you're interested in learning more, well, I'll be looking to post videos when I can. I also do stream live on Twitch during the weekdays, usually whenever I actually can find myself having the energy to get on. I've been very under, the weather, but I'll have a link to my stream in the description. I also do have a clown guide, which is a slight bit out of date with all of the number changes that are going on, but a lot of the principle behind the numbers still stand. If you do combine your yellows and your pinks in a similar way to as they show on the guide, you should still have a similar outcome, right, with how the numbers have been moved so far. So I do want to say that. I'll link my clown guide in the description as well. And lastly, if you really like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe, not just for yourself so you know when I post new videos, but also because it really helps me out a lot with the YouTube algorithm. It's going to push my videos to more people, and thus it means that more people are able to learn and hear what I have to say about my, all the stuff when it comes to Dead by Daylight and yada yada. But other than that, I hope y'all really enjoyed this video, and I'll see y'all next time. Later, gang.